Now, as mentioned before, to make sure that we switch to a different screen if we tap this button, we must dive into two important new concepts: rendering content conditionally and lifting state up. And I want to start with rendering content conditionally. In our quiz widget, which is the main widget we use for starting our overall user interface, we are at the moment displaying the start screen in the end, wrapped inside of material app, scaffold, and our container with a gradient, but wrapped in there, we're outputting the start screen. And if you want to replace some content on the screen with some other content, for example, after a button has been pressed, you simply have to replace the widget here in your code because the entire user interface is controlled with code. So what we could do here is that in our quiz state class maybe, we have a variable which could be the active screen, if you want to call it like this. And active screen could be set equal to start screen, like that. And this is something we haven't done up to this point, but you can store widgets in variables. This is absolutely allowed because widgets are just objects and objects are just regular values in Dart. So you're not limited to storing some text or some numbers like 30, but you can store widgets inside of variables. And that's what I'm doing here, storing a widget in a variable. And of course, here we can add const, but it's still a widget. And now we can, of course, add a method here to this quiz state class, which could be called switch screen, where we want to navigate to a different screen. So which returns no value, but in which we use setState, a function provided by Flutter that's available inside of classes that extend state, as you learned. And to setState, you have to pass a function, for example, an anonymous function. And in this function, you then should perform any data changing activities that should be reflected on the user interface. So in there, we could set active screen to our questions screen here. And for that, of course, questions screen must be imported. So you must add an import statement where you import from your own package and there from the questions screen.dart file. With that, questions screen should be available if I add the missing S. And we would now override the value stored in active screen with this screen widget here when executing switch screen. Now at the moment this causes an error because a value of type questions screen indeed can't be assigned to a variable of type start screen. And we get this error because active screen infers its type from the value that's used for initializing this variable. And this value, whilst being a widget, is of course also of type start screen. Because whenever you create a class in Dart, that class also automatically gives you a type of the same name. So the start screen class, which we defined here, also gives us a start screen type. And that type in the end is based on the widget type, but is a bit more specific than the widget type. It's specific to this class with exactly its details, its extra properties, or whatever it might have. So in order to make sure that active screen is a bit less restrictive and accepts all kinds of widgets, not just start screen, you can replace var here with widget. And that's one of the use cases or scenarios where you indeed would want to replace var with a more specific type. Because here I don't want to use Dart's type inference because it's too restrictive, and instead set active screen to a more general type, which in the end is met by both start screen and by questions screen. And now if we add const here as well, we would have some valid code that would actually change this variable value whenever this function is executed. And how does this help us? Well, this helps us because now we can use the active screen variable down here as a value for child. Because child, and that's important to keep in mind, just wants a widget. And of course, active screen now stores a widget. So we can use active screen as a value here for a child, because this simply leads to Dart looking into this variable and using that value that's currently stored in this ActiveScreen variable as a value for this child argument. So that's how we could conveniently output different widgets here by simply storing different widgets in a variable. And since we call setState, and that's also why it's important to call setState, this build method will be executed again. Because that's what setState does in Flutter apps. When you call setState in a state class, so a class connected to a stateful widget, Flutter will re-execute the build method and therefore run all this code here again, and then it will compare the result of executing that code to the result it got the last time it executed the build method. And if there are any differences, it goes ahead and updates the rendered UI accordingly. And indeed here for this widget, for the quiz widget, when the build method is executed for the first time, ActiveScreen will be set to start screen, and that will therefore be used as a value down there, and hence the start screen would be displayed. But if then for whatever reason switch screen executed and ActiveScreen would be set to question screen with help of setState, the build method would run again, but now ActiveScreen is equal to questions screen, and therefore down here, questions screen would be output. And Dart would detect that there are differences between these two widget trees, the old one and the new one, and it would update the UI accordingly. That's important to understand, which is why I'm emphasizing it. And this approach we're using here, where we're setting a variable to different values, is one way of rendering content conditionally. It's not the only way, and you'll see some other ways later as well, but this is one way. But of course, at the moment, we're never executing switch screen. This switch screen function here, the switch screen method, is not connected to this button. And that's of course what must change, and that's exactly what we'll do by lifting the state up.